This is part 2 of the organic molecules lecture. We're moving on to talk about carbohydrates. And remember, carbohydrates are the first of the 4 types of organic molecules that we'll be discussing during this lecture. And carbohydrates are basically long chains of sugars, or it can mean an individual sugar group, a carbohydrate such as glucose, for example, or fructose, for example. So we're going to talk about what are the basic characteristics first of carbohydrates, and then we'll talk a little bit about how you make long chains of carbohydrates. So carbohydrates all have this basic formula to them. They contain 1 carbon for every 2 hydrogens for every 1 oxygen. This little N down here means that if you have if your N is 2, for example, that would mean you have 2 carbons. 2 times 2 is 4 hydrogen, 2 oxygen in your carbohydrate. If the N were 12, you'd have C12, H24, O12. Easy way to figure out if a molecule you're looking at could be a carbohydrate. If there's only carbons, hydrogens, and oxygens present and nothing else, count up the number of carbons, count up the number of hydrogens, count up the number of oxygens, and if you get this 1 to 2 to 1 ratio, you have a carbohydrate. Now, carbohydrates serve as the probably the most common energy source among living organisms like us and plants. It's a molecule that it has a great deal of energy packed into it between the bonds, and by breaking those bonds apart in a process we're going to learn about later in the semester called oxidative respiration, we can release that energy and use it to perform work in the body. For every mole, that's 6.023 times 10 to the 23 molecules of carbohydrates, there are about 4.23 kilocalories of energy. So quite a bit in there for these different types of carbohydrates. Another common feature you'll see of all the carbohydrates, for the most part, that we're going to be discussing in class is frequently the name will end in the letters OSE. Glucose, fructose, galactose, sucrose, maltose, etc. So that's often a tip-off or a key for you that you're looking at a carbohydrate if the name ends in OSE. Because there are lots and lots of hydrogens bonded to oxygens in molecules of carbohydrates and lots of oxygens present, these are very hydrophilic molecules. They have lots of those partial positive and partial negative charges that would mean they would dissolve very readily in water, which also has partial positive and negative charges. Now, these sugars, carbohydrates, can occur either in long straight chains, or the individual molecules can appear in a ring like you see here in this molecule. And by the way, just so you know, anytime you see a molecule like this one over here, at each of these intersection points where nothing is written, it's assumed that that's a carbon atom present there. Organic chemists get tired of writing down carbons all the time, so they just use the presumption that at each of these intersections there is a carbon molecule, unless they indicate otherwise, like here where you can see they've indicated that there is an oxygen present there rather than a carbon. Now, there are different types of carbohydrates. You can have a single carbohydrate molecule, which we often call a mono, meaning one, saccharide. Okay, monosaccharides are single unit carbohydrates, and some examples include glucose, like we just talked about on the last slide. Here's a molecule of glucose down here, you can see. It can include things like fructose, ribose, deoxyribose. These last two, by the way, are sugar groups found in the nucleic acids DNA and RNA, which we will talk about shortly. You can have 2 of these monosaccharides joined together, in which case you've now formed a disaccharide. 2 examples of that are maltose and sucrose. And I want to show you this example of maltose down here. Maltose is one molecule of glucose joined to another molecule of glucose. And remember again, the way we always join together organic molecules is to use that process called dehydration synthesis. We remove water in the form of a hydroxy group from one molecule and a hydrogen group from the other molecule, and that forms the water that's released, and we get a joining of these two glucose molecules together. That forms the disaccharide called maltose. All right, one last thing that I want to talk about very quickly with carbohydrates are polysaccharides. Polysaccharides are when you have the joining of 3 or more of these individual sugar units. And again, remember the process by which we always join things together: dehydration synthesis. So some examples of polysaccharides include starch and glycogen, which I already talked about previously; cellulose, which is just another version of sugar molecules joined together. If you're writing on paper right now, you're writing on cellulose, another type of polysaccharide. Peptidoglycan is a version of polysaccharides that you find in the cell walls of bacteria, like this bacterium right here. And chitin is yet another version of a polysaccharide that is found in the exoskeleton, or the outer covering, of things like crabs, lobsters, insects. It's even found in the cell walls of fungi, okay, things like mushrooms and yeast. So that's it for carbohydrates. Next up, we're going to be talking about lipids.